Welcome to NetBox Heroes. This is a podcast that's inspired by the NetBox and the network automation communities, where we're featuring and we're learning from some of the awesome networking pros in our community. I'm Chris Beavers. I'm the CEO of NetBox Labs, and I'm your host today. There's a really exciting ecosystem that's formed around NetBox and other open source networking and network automation projects. And our goal with this podcast, NetBox Heroes, is to learn about the people in our community and how they've developed in their careers as networkers, what their networks are like, some of the problems they're tackling, how NetBox and other tech fits into their stack. Um, I am very excited today to have Michael Kutka on the podcast. Michael's been in networking for most of his professional career, and he's grown from an individual contributor right up through lead engineering and now management roles. Right now, Michael is managing the network services team at Insight Global. And Michael's also pretty active in the community. So, for example, if you were out at Cisco Live recently, you might have run into him. I know Jordan from our team did. And Michael, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you here and learn some more.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor. So thank you.
Appreciate that. Well, why don't we start with sort of the obvious? Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and in particular, like how'd you find your way into networking?
Yeah, thank you. So as you said, I'm Michael Kutka, manager of network services at Insight Global. And I kind of found myself into networking ever since high school. So back in high school, we had this program called Fortech, and essentially, you had two periods where you would go and help the different teachers with their computers or their projectors within the different classrooms. And in between that time, when teachers weren't having any issues, we were back in the lab tinkering away, studying for our A plus. So got the A plus, and that eventually led me into just having free time in the class. And what we would do is we'd set up kind of LAN parties, and we'd be able to play things like Counter Strike and stuff like that. And setting up the network and the switches and having all the computers talk on this LAN really intrigued me. So when I went to college, I started going. I went into IT as my major, and specifically into network infrastructure and security fundamentals. And ever since then, I've just really enjoyed understanding how a network works, how people communicate across the public internet. And the rest was history. It's just always been something that's very intrigued me.
It's funny. I have a sort of a similar backstory in that, gaming motivates a lot of future behavior, right? And for me, it was Quake and MechWarrior and the time of modems, right? And
Hmm.
IPX LANs and things like that. And they don't quite do it like they used to these days. It's all
Mm-mm.
a little too easy now, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has gotten a lot easier than back in the day.
That's right. Well, tell me about, some of those first like professional experiences in networking. What were some of the first roles you had, as a network engineer? What were some of the problems you were solving there? And then maybe we can explore where it's come since then.
Yeah, so I started my career after graduating. I started working actually at Insight Global. I've been at Insight
Mm,
Global over 8 years now. And I actually started on the service desk and working on the service desk, you're resetting passwords, adding people to the distribution list, and that got really old really quickly. So my professors always said, you need to go for the CCNA. So I ended up getting my CCNA and wanted to, get into a network engineer role or a network analyst role. And I told that to Insight Global, and they actually only had at the time one network engineer on staff. And I identified this as a gap. What if this
mm,
person wants to take vacation? So I went to my our CIO and I proposed like, hey, I got my CCNA. I would love to shadow this network engineer and eventually move into a network analyst role. So he liked my initiative, and he took that, and we created a plan to get myself into this role. And that's kind of just how things progressed. And I joined the network engineering team about 8 months after I started on the service desk there at Insight, and the rest has kind of been history. It was interesting though, as after I was promoted onto the network engineering team as a network analyst, 2 days later, that network engineer quit. So I was I was a network analyst with a, a somewhat fresh CCNA, and I was supporting 60 plus offices of Insight Global with their MPLS, managed MPLS network. And it was like drinking through a fire hose. I definitely have to thank my manager at the time, our infrastructure manager. Um, YouTube was extremely helpful, and it was an interesting experience, and just very grateful for the patience that our IT team had with me while I was learning. So yeah, it's it's just been nothing but up from there here at Insight. They've trusted me to evaluate solutions and implement them, and it's been a great experience so far.
There's, two things I kind of hear there that are really complementary. One is you took a really proactive approach, right? Like you had a point of view for something you were really interested in, and you made a case for it, like a real business case for why it was important, and that that turned out to be true, in fact, right? And the
Hmm.
other, and something that we've heard from, I think, almost every one of our guests on NetBox Heroes has been, just dive in and start to do the work too. And in your case, it was a little involuntary, right? Like suddenly you're the guy, right? And you had to dive in and start to do the work. But that's the fastest path to learning, is real hands-on engagement. Using the tools at hand, but solving the problems that are really in front of you. And it sounds like that's borne out.
Yeah, I would agree 100%. Jumping in and asking, I know my role was on the service desk, but I was asking this network engineer at the time, it's like, hey, we get tickets from the field all the time, let me troubleshoot, give me access to the ISP portal so I can open the tickets and at least get that process started. And that made it very easy for him to also back me up when I was, providing this business case to
Mm.
the CIO and the management team to come over to that team. So, taking the initiative and knowing where you want to go, don't be complacent and just wait for something to happen. You need to put in the time and effort and show where you're working that you have initiative and you want to keep growing.
And I think that, for you, like that initiative obviously is continued, right? And so you've gotten the opportunity to grow in your career and your roles at Insight Global, through a lead role and now manager role. So you've kind of taken that leap into management. Tell us a little about, what led to that. What's that been like? Um, what's different?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the network engineering team is kind of just two people, and as Inside Global's grown, we've had requirements to keep growing our business. We just deployed a phone system call manager, and having a dedicated voice engineer that kind of falls underneath the networking team. Security is important, so we have a NetSec engineer now. And as the team continued to grow, it just became too much for our infrastructure engineer, and not just the networking team. We're growing our SRE teams, our Windows team. So just as there's organic growth within the company, it led to needing a team lead, to, excuse me, to funnel that information up to management.
Mm.
Needed eventually, we broke up into network operations and network engineering and architecture. So we need a manager to manage, both of those teams, and then have team leads on those different verticals. So the engineering team can focus on, new product evaluations and the actual implementations, and the network operations team operates like the day two, the
Mm.
operations, building out new offices, things that are more repetitive and are already documented very well. So it's been an interesting experience, growing up, being a individual contributor. I would say, even as a manager, I still evaluate the projects, and there's some certain projects that I'll tinker around with and kind of still be an individual contributor, but it's definitely much less so, and it's making sure projects are staying on track. My team has the right resources, making sure we have training available, and pushing those individuals on the
Mm.
team to grow. No one wants to be a network analyst on the operations team just fighting fires. You want to get to that network engineer owning those higher level tasks and project implementations and things like that. So making sure that everyone on my team has those resources, and I'm pushing them and helping them grow, has been a very rewarding part of being a manager.
Yeah, I'll say, for me, I would echo the same, right? Like one of the sort of hidden elements of being a manager of people that is really the most gratifying is like you yourself got to go through a path of growth, and continue that, but now you get to help others, on their path of career growth and advancement and push them, right?
Hmm.
To continue to grow. So that's really great. One last question here is, I imagine there's quite a few folks in our community who are asking themselves the question, do I want to, continue my path into management, or do I want to continue as an engineer or individual contributor? Do you have any advice for folks who are thinking about that, transition into management, either, around how to make that happen, or what to think about as they're considering that choice?
Yeah, I mean, I would say sit long and hard, because it's something that I kind of was pushed into, and I wasn't sure if how I would sit with it. You need to be a people person. There are going to be a lot of non-technical things that you have to deal with, having one-on-ones with people. There's always the politics of the business, and making, sometimes you might think it is a solution that is going to benefit the business, but there's other people that their tasks or priorities are higher from a business perspective. So you need to be able to swallow those things. You need to be able to discuss these solutions, and make sure that you're verbalizing them correctly to upper management, because they don't speak the tech talk that a lot of us who have grown up and been in and working on these solutions talk. So I would say, sit long and hard, think about it. Do you have the ability to kind of dumb things down, and be able to talk with business? And then do you have that people interaction? Do you enjoy helping people grow? Do you feel like you still have a lot that you still need to learn from a networking perspective? Because to be an effective leader, you need to make sure that you understand the networking fundamentals, and can be able to explain those to people growing in their careers as well. It the Google box, it's a great resource, and you can go out and search for things, and you know challenging people to go out and learn on their own is great, but there are some times where you need to sit with people and talk them through things like subnetting. We have people coming up. I have two individuals that just came up off the service desk, and they're studying for their Net Plus right now, and sometimes I have to go back because I've been doing this so long. It's like, oh yeah, how do I subnet again? So just making sure that you have a good solid networking fundamentals, and the willingness to help people grow, I think, is a huge part of being a manager.
Yeah, it's a very different day-to-day existence than being, like an individual contributor engineer. But and I think your advice is really well taken, right? You really should, if you're considering that path, go into it, fully aware, right? That it's a different kind of job, and one with a lot of impact, but different kinds of impact, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
100%.
Why don't we pivot, Michael, over to the technology side a little bit now? So, I think, maybe a good starting point, and you've touched on it here and there a little bit already, but everybody's going to be curious about, what is the network like at Insight Global? What are some of the basics of it, and some of the things that you're managing?
Yeah, so we have almost 70 plus offices now. We've started expanding over into the UK and then also over into the Philippines. Our network, when I started here, was traditional managed MPLS from two different ISPs. And that's kind of transitioned over the years that I've been here. We've transitioned to SD-WAN so that we don't need to leverage an expensive MPLS provider anymore to still have that same consistency and experience for our end users. So our end users are primarily recruiters and account managers. They are cold calling and looking for client or contractors to staff at our clients, such big companies like Microsoft, Cisco, Google, all those kind of places, and even smaller
Mm,
places. So we need to make sure that our end users have internet access, can get to LinkedIn or jobs.com and all those different resources and make sure that the phone systems work. So as I kind of mentioned, we transitioned from a managed MPLS provider, two of them, over to DIA and broadband circuits to reduce costs.
mm,
And that kind of was a good experience, but also it changed a lot of things within our environment and led to some challenges. So.
well, that might be a good thing for us to pick up right away, even. What I'm hearing is, obviously a pretty large distributed network footprint, a lot of offices all over the place now, all over the world even, which has complexity to me to a degree. But what are some of the kind of modern challenges that you're dealing with in managing and operating and extending and so on the network as it is today?
Yeah, so SLAs for different ISPs,
Mm,
because we no longer have these managed providers, we always had a single throat to choke, or actually two, because we had two ISPs. So, we knew if a circuit went down at our Charlotte office, okay, they either have Lumen or Comcast. So we got to
hmm
figure out which one's down and then call that provider. But now with an SD-WAN solution and it's distributed, we can leverage multiple internet providers. So being able to track and order ISPs at different remote offices has been the biggest challenge because now it's
mm,
identifying, okay, who are the internet service providers at this location? Which one is down? What is their phone number to call and reach out
mm,
to? It's a lot more complex. We have reduced costs and it's more efficient, and we can have multiple ISP, like three or four ISPs at a location now instead of the tube, and be able to load balance across those. But one starts having a blackout or a brownout at a location, it's like, how do we identify which one that is and then start troubleshooting those issues? So,
mm.
you know, that's something that NetBox has been able to help for us, having a source of truth, being able to manage all of our circuits in this solution so that all we have to do is identify which office and then boom, we know all the different ISPs that are there. And it's helped us with that challenge.
That's really interesting, and as you would imagine, I certainly want to come to that and talk a little about that use case and others with NetBox. Another thing I kind of hear in there, and I'd love to explore for just a minute with you, is um, that act of diagnosing, like which of these providers is having an issue, what's the nature of the issue, and so on, is pretty interesting too. I think a lot of folks in our community are needing now to invest more into, call it observability, or network monitoring and analysis tools to really do that debugging, or even detect what's going on. Is that a piece of the puzzle for you and your network? How do you think about that diagnosis when you know something is wrong, but you got to figure out what?
Yeah, so we're leveraging a couple of different internal or monitoring solutions, Logic Monitor and Thousand Eyes. Your typical, ISP monitoring for
Hmm
bandwidth consumption, up, down status, and identifying where in the circuit path the issue is. So those are the big tools that are helping us identify when we find an issue, identify that issue, and then start using other tools to troubleshoot. getting into the CLI and escalating those issues to the
Mm,
ISP if it is an ISP issue. Not always, it's not always an ISP issue. So it does take the network operations team, some time to dive in and start, doing that um, layer one, layer two troubleshooting to determine where the issue actually is.
mm, got it. One other question before we get to NetBox that I'm curious about a little bit is automation, right? So, large, complex network footprint, a lot of, I guess I would call it heterogeneity probably in your footprint, um, and a relatively small team. So, can you tell me just a little bit about, how automation has become part of your practice, or if it has, and a little about what that is starting to look like?
Yeah. So when I was maybe one of four people on the team, I started looking into automation solutions, and we've been leveraging Ansible for a long time, deploying different VLANs or SVIs to our network infrastructure, because we probably have about 400 or 500 switches within our environment, and being able to deploy those things at scale is definitely important. Just recently, we had an engineer who needed to deploy a new VLAN, and we got him all set up with Ansible, and he was off to the races and able to deploy. Um, excuse me. He was able to deploy a new SVI, and actually, he even deployed SNMP version 3 to 400 or 500 switches within about 2 or 3 weeks, instead of it
Mm,
taking who knows how long to do that manually. So leveraging Ansible from that perspective for different ad hoc changes, um, it's been imperative to our team in how we can execute at scale. Another thing that we've been doing recently is we've been leveraging a colleague of mine on the team and myself. We're starting to transition a lot more sites to Meraki, because of COVID and the way things have become more hybrid. A lot of our offices are essentially what I like to call glorified Starbucks.
hmm
They're internet cafes with big internet pipes, and we don't really need, we don't have a lot of traffic. We just need to make sure voice traffic is being routed correctly, and then our internal applications. So we started migrating a lot of our offices to more of a Meraki solution, and we've leveraged Meraki's API and Python to fully automate the deployment of remote offices. And we've actually, when we were using SD-WAN and then Catalyst switches and then Meraki APs, we were doing everything ad hoc when standing up a new office, and that would
hmm
take, an engineer 3 to 4 days working with a tech on site. And now we've gotten that 3 to 4 day process for a new office deployment from down to about 8 hours. We
hmm
just tell the tech on site how to rack everything, how to cable it up, and we have this Python script that kind of goes through and asks, what's the address of the location? What do you want to name the site? What's the IP subnet? And it will then go and deploy all of that equipment and adds the equipment with the IP reservations into info blocks, adds them into NetBox, adds the subnets in there, creates the DHCP scopes, adds all the devices to ICE. So it's a really cool solution, and it's allowed our team to be much more efficient when standing up remote offices, because
mm
Inside Global, ever since I've been here, we've been opening at least 5 offices a year, and that
hmm
includes during COVID. So making sure we're efficient in opening those offices, and everything is consistent is very important.
We hear this kind of use case very often, of course, in any environment that's opening a lot of branch locations or offices or retail locations or whatever, and this pattern of let's turn the remote location into effectively a glorified Starbucks, is a really increasingly prevalent pattern. The other thing I hear there on automation generally is like, um, there are common workflows that take a lot of time, and you're reducing that constraint, and presumably also improving like the consistency and the reliability of the workflow that you're enacting when you implement some automation against it, right? So, I think another pattern that we hear over and over from all of our guests, right, is automation needn't be some shiny, glorified, AI enhanced
Hmm.
mega thing that runs the network on its own. It's really about relaxing those human constraints of, the thing that you do repetitively tons of times a year or a month or a day. How do we streamline that and make it less error prone?
Yeah, everyone who says they're scared of automation and it's going to take their job, there's no way because there needs to still be those people on the back end who are creating those constraints that the automation runs on. You need to define the framework so that it doesn't just go off and start taking down your network. So I've embraced automation in my career and learning those things. I definitely did not like Python and coding back in college, so that's why I went the networking route. But seeing how things are changing and the way the industry is moving, it's one of those things that you need to embrace or die. You'll go the way of the dinosaur if you don't kind of start embracing those things. So it's not going to
Hmm.
put us out of business. I'm not even scared about AI putting us out of business. It's going to only help us be more efficient in my perspective.
No, I think that's a great perspective. Okay, well, why don't we, pick back up the NetBox topic for a moment or two. You started to talk a little about where NetBox fits into your environment, but maybe even before we dive into that, what led you and the team at Insight Global to NetBox in the first place? I'm curious, like, what was the fundamental problem where you said, "There's the tool," or here, what was the discovery that said, "Okay, NetBox, let's go start to tinker with that."
Yeah, so I'm gonna be honest, like I first learned about NetBox probably 4 or 5 years ago. And when I was starting out as a network engineer or network analyst on our team, and we needed some solution that was going to be, our IPAM and to manage or have our source of truth for our equipment. So I implemented it and I started working with it. And this was the infancy days of NetBox. And we were using it and it was a good, but it was hard for, me to keep up on my own. It wasn't, it didn't really have that many API integrations, so we weren't able to really track, creating DNS records weren't
Mm,
replicating over and whatnot. So it kind of fell to the wayside and it was just sitting in our environment and it kind of wasn't being used. Fast forward to, when we started transitioning from, MPLS to SD-WAN, I started looking at, okay, how are we going to start tracking all of these different circuit providers? And, I did a quick
mm,
search and that's where I was like, oh, NetBox, like we already have this. Let's start using this again. So we started getting all of our internet circuits as we were migrating sites from MPLS to internet, one by one, adding the sites in there and creating it as our source of truth for circuits in our environment and being able to very easily click on our Charlotte or our Atlanta office
mm,
and say, oh, we have Comcast and AT&T, or we have Lumen and Cogent at this location, and then seeing exactly what the circuit IDs were, exactly what the number to call for an issue, just having everything right in there, when what the bandwidth is for the circuits, and that's where we kind of started really embracing NetBox again
mm,
and actually using it and getting it to be our IPAM, getting all of our equipment in there and start tracking end of life for the equipment. And then eventually start integrating it with APIs into
mm,
um, different things like Ansible and having it be that source of truth as well. So,
So it sounds like, from maybe an early use case that didn't quite stick to, a more modern use case, starting with something as simple as like we got to keep track of all the circuit providers in these different locations and all the details about them to now a more expansive source of truth use case that's incorporating a bunch of the different models and capabilities and is integrated into some of these workflows we've talked about. Is that
hmm
about right?
yeah, that's exactly right. Being it, we didn't want to keep having this creep because we were using monitoring solution and we were tracking IP addresses. We had Excel documents and for all of our servers and whatnot. So leveraging NetBox to kind of be able to track all of at least the network team's virtual
Hmm.
infrastructure as well as our switching infrastructure and the circuits that it really just led into that and being able to, start leveraging that as a source of truth for network automation has been huge as well.
One of the things that I've been hearing a lot about, and I'd love your just gut reaction to, is historically, and you just described a version of this. Most teams have had a bunch of different sources of truth, right? You've got your IPAM tool over here, and you're tracking your servers in an Excel spreadsheet, and all the different data about your network in different sources of truth. And some of the power in NetBox is, it's centralizing your source of truth and bringing all that information together and into alignment and cohesiveness. And that's maybe more important than having, an IPAM over here that's, part of a DDI solution and a, different tool over here that's part of some other solution. The source of truth data really belongs together, and that's important to the strategy. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and that's something that I feel like Insight Global is struggled with because we have some internal applications that are using all sorts of different sources of truth. And
Mm,
so, like for example, our call manager is pulling from Active Directory and replicating and adding users in there, but it's like our other internal applications aren't leveraging Active Directory as their source of truth. So, like when someone goes into our online directory,
hmm
that extension isn't replicating. So, having something that for at least the network infrastructure and the things that the network team cares about, having our single source of truth has been very beneficial in streamlining not only mostly the troubleshooting process for our network operations team. They're no longer having to dive into multiple tools to figure out, what is at a
mm,
location, what does the rack look like at a remote office, starting to leverage NetBox for rack elevations and be
mm,
able to add pictures and things like that, so that an end user knows exactly what when he's calling the remote office and guiding someone through troubleshooting or power cycling a switch or something along that nature. They know exactly what they're looking at, and what the end user is looking at. They don't have
mm,
to worry about FaceTiming or anything like that. So.
Fascinating. Oh, really interesting. And then the other thing you mentioned here, just quickly, is that NetBox is starting to, increasingly be at the center of your automation strategy. Talk about that just a little bit more. Like, how does NetBox fit into some of those automated workflows, or, the automation stack that you're deploying into those workflows?
Yeah, so leveraging Ansible and using NetBox's APIs to pull and be able to push configuration directly from or to an office defined by NetBox has been beneficial and is kind of streamlined and made us be able to test changes or push changes to individual environments. And it's also allowed for the different engineers to no longer have to manage host files for Ansible directly on the jump server, so that if someone adds a new office, it's it's added into NetBox, and then everyone is able to start making changes using
Mm,
Ansible. We don't have to have a shared host file within our environment anymore, and making sure everyone has that updated file has been, continued to streamline the process, making sure that, when changes are made to an environment and push, we're able to use Ansible to push those changes, and then within our Ansible playbooks, create tasks to also add those new devices directly
mm,
within NetBox and make, dynamic updates to the environment. And that's we've just started getting our feet wet with NetBox as the source of truth. So I'm really excited to see how we continue leveraging it. We were previously using DNA Center as our source of truth, and it was always finicky. So being able to leverage NetBox and the open source community,
mm,
to fall back on and be able to help and troubleshoot issues has been, very beneficial. And there's just so many resources out there when it comes to NetBox. Reaching out to Jeremy or Jordan, they're more than willing to help. So that's been an awesome experience instead of having to, open up a TAC case and wait for an engineer, and then maybe them not being, very, responsive. It's very, it's, I love the open source community around NetBox.
Oh, it's wonderful. You read my mind. That was going to be a question I was going to ask you anyway, Michael. And so it sounds like some of the most direct value that you're finding in the open source community is around just that willingness to engage, that openness to, help you think about your use case or diagnose issues you're running into. Um, so maybe a different question on the open source side for one second. Maybe our last question for today is. Um, it, this is an open source project. It's a really powerful one. It's got this incredible community around it, really engaged group of folks. What are your hopes for where NetBox heads as an open source project? Where do you hope new functionality gets added or new capabilities come to bear, new kinds of integrations? What are some of the like wish list items you have for the project?
Oh man, I mean, it's the solution's already been just, great for us, and everything that's coming out for NetBox, um, it's been amazing. So, I honestly I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I'm interested as we continue moving more towards a Meraki and a cloud managed solution, how that can work with
Hmm.
NetBox. Because with Meraki, you have everything there in the cloud management portal, but leveraging NetBox still with, NetBox Cloud, how that can integrate with Meraki. I'm trying to think of some use cases, but nothing's really coming to mind. I know actually Meraki has a lot of like sensors and cameras and things like that. So that might be something interesting to look in and see how that data can be replicated from the Meraki cloud portal to maybe the NetBox portal. So somehow how those things can be managed and integrated. But no, I mean honestly, from my perspective, NetBox is such a great tool, leverage it to manage our on-prem infrastructure and manage end of life and our circuits, you know, and just continuing to be a solution that is openly supported by the open source community. I don't know. I can't really think of any wish list things because it's kind of checked all of the boxes that I want from a source of truth. I guess continuing to expand on how the API interacts with different tools like info blocks and better integrations there. That's probably something that it's already built out and I just haven't really dove into. So um, looking forward to just learning more and continuing to use NetBox for different use cases within our environment.
That's really helpful, Michael. And I think there's a couple themes there that are interesting to me and I think our community at large. One is, look, networks are becoming more complicated in a lot of dimensions, and one of them is they're not all, kind of traditional network on-prem infrastructure anymore either, right? Your Meraki point, I generalized to cloud networking is really a thing, and one of the things I think that we and the maintainers and others in the NetBox ecosystem are thinking a lot about is, how does NetBox help solve problems in a call it a hybrid world, right? So
Hmm.
that's one theme I'm hearing, and then the other one is just, there's a lot of other technology and tools in your ecosystem, and the more connected NetBox is, the more helpful it is in that source of truth role. So that's
Actually,
good.
one thing that, just comes to mind is, cloud infrastructure. Having NetBox have maybe a cloud section within there to, you know, be able to go into one, source of truth from a network perspective and look exactly in US East 1 or Azure's East 1 environment and know exactly what subnets and network applications are living in there. I think that would be cool to see NetBox expand from the traditional on-prem network into the cloud network.
Mm.
So
No, really helpful. And certainly you're not alone in that feedback or thinking about that for sure. Well, with that, Michael, I think we've reached the end of our show for today. So let me say again, thank you so much for joining and sharing all this with us today. Some really fascinating and fun discussions that we had over the last half hour or so. And for everyone who's listening, and thanks to all of you in the community, in the NetBox and the network automation communities for tuning in and for helping each other out, for contributing in so many ways. See you all next time, and thanks again, Michael.
thank you for having me. Have a good one.